Well, this one is a very much anticipated one. I've been waiting for a long time, as you also have been waiting. And yeah, we are very excited to share this. And this is going to be very interesting. There are some tutorials, some videos about how to export the right way from Revit to IFC. But this is going to be very special. And Dian is going to tell you why actually this is going to be like something that there is no anywhere on the internet.
Hey Petru, thanks for having me today. Today we're going to be covering getting the best quality IFCs out of Revit. And what we're going to do is we're going to have Revit open in one screen. I've got it over here, just a blank file. And I've got Blender open in another screen. And we're going to be doing some exports out of Revit. And we're going to use Blender and the BlenderBIM add-on, free software, to go and investigate the quality of the IFC that's coming out in a way that most IFC viewers will not show you. And then we'll show you how to go back into Revit and fix those things as best you can. And we will also cover lots of the different workarounds you can use, as well as things which are maybe not advertised or you may not notice in the IFC export settings by Autodesk, which should hopefully uncover a lot of interesting issues and make us a lot more insightful about the quality of BIM that we're actually producing on our projects. Okay, so in this session, we'll start very, very basic. We're only going to cover a couple things. We're going to cover the basic export settings, setting the project name, and basic coordinates. And that's it, nothing more. We'll go into types and materials and all the rest of it later on. We'll just start simple. So the very first thing you want to do is make sure that you have the right IFC export add-in. So most Revit users, if you just go to File and Export an IFC, yes, you can export an IFC, but actually the version that comes installed with Revit is very likely an extremely outdated version, which has many bugs and problems. And I won't list them all today. We're going to be nice and snappy. I'm just going to say you have to upgrade to the latest one. And how you upgrade depends on which Revit version you have. So if you see a dialog like this and you'll notice there's no version number over here, then that's a sign that you are using a very, very old version of the IFC exporter. So this is on Revit 2022. Here I have Revit 2021. And if I go to export an IFC, you'll notice that this one has a version number. And that's a good sign that at the very least, you're using a non-ancient version of the IFC exporter. So that's a good indicator as to whether or not you're using the right one. So where you install this depends on what Revit version you have. And you can go, right now I'm going to go back to Revit 20. On Revit 2019, the best place to get it is on the Autodesk App Store. You press download, you ask your corporate for a admin password, you press install, you restart Revit, and you should be good to go. Same for Revit 2020, it's also on the App Store. You press download, you're good to go. Now for Revit 2021 and above, you go to a different place. The best place is to go to this GitHub, and all of these links should be in the video. So you go to this GitHub page, then you click on releases. Then you press Ctrl F to search in this page for your Revit version. So if you're using 2022, this is the latest one on 24th of August. You can see that's actually pretty recent. So you're not using something, you know, and that's pretty good. Great, so the first thing we want to do is let's just draw a wall and we'll go click IFC export. And the first thing you want to do is change your setup over here. You don't want to be using the default setup. You also don't want to be using IFC 2x3. We covered that in the previous video. There are lots of reasons why you shouldn't be on that anymore. What I'd recommend is also to use specifically the IFC4 design transfer view. And the way to understand this is that there are two preset settings of how to store your IFC information. The first is called reference view, the second is design transfer. In the reference view, it's designed for a very dumb version of IFC data where a lot of the smart semantics are removed. So for example, when a wall is exported, and I'll show you this, instead of seeing parametrically the layers and the thickness of each layer in a wall, you will just get dumb individual geometry. And the benefit of that is that any simple viewer will definitely work for it. But the disadvantage is that you've just lost a huge amount of really rich BIM information that you've spent time working on. So for most cases, I would say this is a lot better because this can always be downgraded back down to architecture.
But let me ask you something before you go further. If you choose that one, the latest one, the design transfer view, is that okay for all the disciplines, for architecture, structural, and MEP and everything?
Absolutely. There's no reason why you shouldn't be using it. It's the only reason why it's slightly discouraged sometimes is people view it as a non-certified view of IFC. But as the world progresses towards IFC as a native format and we begin to use more and more of IFC features, there's really no reason why you shouldn't be using it anymore.
Okay, so if you're an architect, structural engineer, or a MEP guy, you should use the same without any worries.
So I've just chosen the reference view just now. I just waited a while for it to export. I'm going to go load and down, and where's it? My documents. Okay, so this is my wall, and you can see in reference view you have all of the. This is one of the main reasons why you want to be using design transfer, and you can see that my wall has been broken down into constituents, but I've lost all the semantics about the thickness of the various layers. And it's very difficult for me to parametrically redraw this wall. And it's the same with openings as well. All openings are applied as well. So you lose the parametric Boolean operations of an opening. So now if I press export again, and this time I'm going to choose the design transfer view. There we go. And that was a lot faster as well, you just noticed, in the first time around. You can see that now my wall is a parametric prism, which has layers, which have various thicknesses. You know, there's 102.5 mil of that, 75 mil of that, there's 100 mil of this, there's 12.5 mil of that, which gives me a total thickness of a 290 thick wall.
I have an issue with this though.
What's your issue, Petru?
I would like to be possible to actually select the different layers.
Sure, yes.
What do we need to do if you want that?
Even in the previous one, they were all merged into one single object. In here, it would simply be calculated by your software. So in the Blender BIM add-on, you would have to tell it to isolate a single layer. Now that functionality is not yet in the Blender BIM add-on.
Okay, but isn't that something that we can do via using IFC aggregate from Revit and structuring that? Or you say that that functionality can actually be built in Blender BIM without regards to how you are exporting from Revit or other tool?
Correct. You can either explicitly define it and using aggregates. You can say my wall is broken down into different individual elements. But at earlier concept stage design, when architects are drawing walls like this, that's not the right way to go. During fabrication, it is. But during early concept stage, where people are drawing mostly composite walls like this, you don't want to break it down to many, many individual objects. You might want to keep it as a single object at its current level of design resolution. And for that, there are two approaches. The first, in reference view, you saw it was broken down into constituents, which is just dumb, pure geometry, and you've lost the parametric information about it, versus now we've retained the parametric information. So for that reason, I'd say it's better to go design transfer, which you can then use a feature in software like Blender BIM, which doesn't exist yet, to rederive those layer slices.
That's very interesting because I was not aware about this. I used to ask you before about how, for me, it's important to see the different layers in the model. And we talked about the aggregate stuff, but I was not aware that you can actually build this functionality, this feature in Blender BIM. So you can output that. You can read it from the IFC file or the IFC export and see it. I was not aware. So that's a new thing.
Correct. And IFC OpenShell actually can do that. So if we view and we're digressing a little bit, but if we check out the documentation for IFC OpenShell, you'll see a feature in geometry processing. If I go into the geometry settings, there's a processing feature which lets you take a parametrically defined layer set and chop it up like this, and you can see how it's chopped it up. but you can't go back. It's hard to go back. If you can always go back, but it's harder to go back if you do it the other way around. That's one of many, many reasons. And we won't go into all the reasons today, but of course, ask questions in the comments and we'll try to cover them in future videos. But anyway, so the first thing we want to do is, of course, use IFC4. We want to make it based off a design transfer view to keep as much rich parametric information as possible. But now we want to start tweaking the settings. So we're going to go and press the duplicate button here. And we're going to call this my IFC4. And we're going to change some of these settings here. And once you finish changing it, you'll press save. You'll save it somewhere as a file so that later on you can download it. You can load it back. Just in case, sometimes I've noticed it just disappears randomly. I haven't quite worked that out why, but sometimes my settings just. Okay, so this is cool. We want design transfer view. We want IFC, that's fine. This is the .ifc format. We talked about how IFC has different formats. Revit currently supports a few others. We'll stick to .ifc. We'll leave the default phase for now. We'll leave space boundaries. And we'll come back to these settings later. What I will suggest, however, is that you select this option, this export only elements visible in view. And this is because typically, and I'll just cancel out this setting for a moment, is that typically you're going to create a dedicated 3D export view. And so you're going to go and duplicate this view, and you're going to have your own view, which is specifically for the purposes of exporting IFC, where you're going to have a whole bunch of things like filters and a detail level settings being set, because very often you're going to have a lot of junk in your Revit model that's just part of the day-to-day modeling process that are really not part of your export. So for example, if you're copy monitoring things from other disciplines that are not part of your scope, you should be excluding that from your export. So you're going to have a dedicated 3D view here. We'll call this IFC. And once you set up all your filters, you go into your filter settings and you've turned, let's say you're an architect, you'll turn off all this stuff or something like that. Then you will go in your IFC export settings and enable that. So anything filtered out will disappear. Now, if you're an architect, you also want to enable this option, because by default, you'll notice actually all of your rooms and spaces are not exported to IFC. So you spent all this time setting up rooms and spaces and it's lost. So please remember to enable this checkbox if you're an architect. If you're not an architect, disable it because you're not responsible for rooms. We'll talk about spaces later on and areas, but for just talking about architectural rooms for the moment, disable this. We'll talk about that in more detail in a future video. Okay, so now we move on to property sets. Now, the first thing you want to do is actually ensure this one is disabled, unless you're dealing with a small project from an unknown author. And I'll explain that for a moment. So IFC can store properties that are associated with objects. So for example, if I click on this wall, you can see some property sets. And for Revit, think about this like a parameter group and parameters in your parameter group. So IFC has properties in property sets. So we can see a bunch of properties. And you can see, well, if I had a wall selected, these are all the properties of my wall. And if I have that option enabled, what it will do is it will take if I enable this, all of this data will come through in IFC. And the only time that's good is if you're dealing with an unknown author and you don't know where they stored stuff. We talked about how the way people store things in Revit is a mess, right? There's no standard location to put any data. People just make it up as they go. They invent new parameters, and every company has their own standard. So as a result, if you don't know who the author is, you might want to ask them to enable that, in which case all the data comes through. So that sure, you'll get a lot of junk in your file, but at least a few little, 1 out of 100 of these parameters that you do care about, it will still be in there. However, if you do have control over who's authoring this, disable it, because you'll be able to have much finer control over which parameters of these you can trust and which ones you cannot. because as any Revit user knows, on an average project, if you have 100 parameters, maybe less than 10% of them are those you can actually trust. The other 90% are just auto-generated, garbage brought in from imported families, or things like that. Cool. Now, I will also ask to disable this, export IFC common property sets. So IFC defines properties as part of, in its standard, saying, okay, everybody in the world defines fire rating as part of a wall. Here is the exact right spot you should put fire rating. And so Autodesk has gone through that list of standardized properties and said, all right, here's what we can map from Revit things, Revit out of the box things, to IFC out of the box things. The problem is that, again, you cannot trust a lot of those things. You know, if a structural model has fire rating data, do I really trust the structural engineer to have that correct fire rating data? Probably not. And do I trust the architect's model to have the is external or load-bearing data to be correct in every single wall? Also probably not. So what I'd advise is to, again, just disable that. So you notice we had that enabled before. So if you look at this wall, here's what comes out of the box in Revit. And according to this is an external wall. Yes, it is an external wall. It's given me a thermal transmittance value. Wow. I mean, is that right? Is that wrong? You know, it's actually defined it twice. It's defined it on the type and on the occurrence. It's defined a thermal transmittance value twice, and that's a little scary. Load bearing false, maybe, yes, no, who knows? Like extent to structure false. Yeah, you know, in this case, by coincidence, it's correct, but there's a lot of risk in just enabling. So good advice, disable this, and what you want to be doing later on is enabling this fella. And this lets you, in a very granular way, define exactly which properties are high quality and allowed to be exported. We'll talk about this a little later. Okay, we'll move on to exporting your IFC base quantities. Leave that one on. So Revit, when you draw a wall and so on, if I show you this, you can see some dimensions are auto-calculated in Revit, and that's great. That's a good thing. And in IFC, there's also a standard for showing you auto-calculated quantity information, like these dimensions. And IFC has defined, in IFC4, they have defined standardized quantities for different types of objects. So it says wall must have a net side area, a gross side area, for example. Whereas, for example, if I click on this on Revit, it just says area. Now, without looking at this value, would you actually know if that's a side area, a whole area, including top and side and bottom? Is it a gross? Is it a net? I don't know, unless you go check it in more detail. Well, actually, I do know the answer, but let that be an exercise for the viewer. So anyway, the point is that IFC has defined these standard quantities used for quantity takeoff. Again, another great reason to use IFC4, because IFC2X3 doesn't have it. So if you enable that, you will get that for free. And all of that quantity information will come out. So this wall, for example, has automatically come out with height, length, width, gross. And this is fantastic information. Now, I just want to use, again, a word of caution. So this option is fantastic if you're doing any sort of model-based costing. So if you're linking into a software like Costex or, you know, Blender BIM, you can actually use those quantities for parametric IFC costing. Now, most of the time, Revit gets it right. And that's good for most of the basic things. However, there are certain scenarios where Revit does not get it right, and that's something to be aware of. So for example, let's see, if I draw in a beam here, so this beam here, which is a little I-beam, cute little I-beam. Now, if we take a look over here, let's see if we can replicate this bug. Okay, so in this case, I don't see the bug. Oh, sorry, here we are. Could be this one. the surface area. There is a bug where certain areas are just crazy values. And that's okay. Your coster will realize that pretty soon as he starts multiplying things out and realizing things just don't seem right. When he goes, that's the wrong amount of steel in the building, he'll realize. In fact, here, like look at this, right? We have the gross volume and then the net volume. Well, what do you mean? So I just want to say approach it with caution. But it's good that you just enable the box and, you get it right 80% of the time. The other 20%, Autodesk will fix it. So we're almost done for basic export settings. We also want to enable this user-defined property sets. Now, what Revit does is they come with this text file. And let's just see if I can open that text file.
And I guess you get it for the most basic elements like walls and this kind of more simpler geometrical forms, right?
We got 9 more minutes to cover the basics, and then we'll leave it to another video. Okay, here we are. It's a text file that looks like this, which lets you configure what properties you'll be exporting. Now, because we've got 9 more minutes, we're not going to cover it in this video. We'll cover it in the next video where we talk about how to, some recommended things that you should be configuring this file and how this file works. But for now, we're just going to leave that as enabled, and we'll tell you what to insert in this file. Level of detail. Leave this guy alone. He's fine at low. For advanced, also leave everything unchecked if you don't know what you're doing. If you do know what you're doing, by all means, you know it anyway, press whatever box you want. But just by default, feel free to leave this blank. A couple interesting ones are things like the export a bounding box and store the IFC. I do want to have a word of warning for people who are checking this. You might say this is a great way to visually see the IFC GUID. Sorry, I should describe what this is first. So in Revit, every element has an element ID so that you can uniquely pinpoint that element in your file. Same in the IFC. If I click on this guy, he will have his own ID, which looks like that. And if I click on this guy, you can see the ID is, it is different, slightly different, but it is unique. So mostly unique. We'll talk about that in a future video as well. There's some problems with that as well. So if you check this box, that IFC GUID will come into a newly added parameter over here in your Revit parameters list. And that's good for visually looking at it. But it also creates a risk of people editing it into invalid values. So there are better ways of getting the IFC GUID. We won't cover it today. So let's leave that unchecked. We'll press OK. We'll export again. Let's load up that model. Okay, so now you can see what we've achieved so far. We've got IFC4. We've got a design transfer view. Good job. And we have no property sets out of the box. We'll talk about how to choose the ones we want. And we've got a list of auto-generated quantities. So that's it for a good start. In the next video, we will continue tweaking our install to address things like what property set should we use? Is this really a wall? And why does my site say default? And why does my building not even have a name? What's going on? And of course, coordinates. Can't have one of these tutorials without talking about coordinates.